Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom. Uh, Happy Sabbath. And this is you're live here with the Akazaki Yahoo, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahuwah Bahashem, Yahushua HaMashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say shalom wa baruchim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait to the day that the Most High brings us back together, and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High power, under one covenant. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
I'm joined this afternoon by my most esteemed Akinanaya. Shabbat shalom, Aki.
Shabbat shalom, Maki. Shabbat shalom, Yasharal. All praises to the Most High for allowing us yet another set apart yom.
Hallelujah. Yes, indeed. Our praises to the Abba for another Sabbath. We don't take it lightly, and we certainly don't take it for granted that the Abba has allowed us another day of rest to come together uh, to learn and to grow in Him and in understanding. So we have a video review for you today, and we are going to get directly to it. Here we go. All right. And let's listen and learn.
Did you know Black Americans were robbed of $1.3 billion of today's dollars right after slavery, at a time when people were saying that ex-slaves couldn't make it on their own? The Freedmen's Bank was built to prove the opposite. In 1865, Congress set up what was thought to be a Black-owned bank to help newly freed Black Americans. It was supposed to assist ex-slaves in becoming financially responsible, safely storing their money, and creating savings to support the future generation. But it turned out to be one of the biggest scams in history. While it was initially successful, the bank failed because of its mismanagement and fraud. When the bank collapsed, it owed almost $3 million to over 61,000 depositors. It was basically the cornerstone of the racial wealth gap we see today. Here is the true story of Freedmen's Bank, starting off with the bank's foundation.
Yeah, so the disparity that exists between so-called black people and so-called the former slave masters, it's no coincidence. These things have really been set in place, and they started it right after slavery, putting putting up a bank that would appear to be for us. We put our money in there, and the thing fails, and your money gone. So it ain't gone. Somebody got it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It just disappeared. Somebody got it. So let's continue.
Today, it's normal for many of us to have our own savings account. But for formerly enslaved people, many of whom never had any money, this was a foreign concept. In a society driven by capitalism, it was, and still is, crucial to learn how to manage money to survive. The concept of savings banks for Black Americans can be traced back to the Civil War. At that time, almost 180,000 Black people fought for the Union. Some were ex-slaves. They were paid for their services, but received much less than their white counterparts. During this time, paymasters in charge of Black military units were granted the authority to allow every soldier to set aside a specific portion of their earnings to be directed towards either a family member or to the government for savings. These accumulated savings would then be returned to the soldiers upon their discharge. However, during that period, few banks would allow Black Americans to store their money or open an account safely. The very first official bank for Black Americans was the Free Labor Bank. It was established in 1864 in New Orleans. Those who could deposit were free Black men and soldiers who owned property in New Orleans. Other depositors included half-free Black people who worked on federally controlled plantations in Louisiana. The proceeds from plantation sales also went straight into the bank. For many ex-slaves, this was their first experience in financial management. In South Carolina and Virginia, Black soldiers and recently emancipated slaves could use military savings banks. But after the war ended, one of the banks still held on to $200,000. This was because the soldiers who had made deposits had either passed away without traceable relatives, or they had been reassigned to different locations or discharged from service without realizing they could retrieve their funds. Unfortunately, Many ex-slaves had no idea how the banking system worked, and no one was there to help them out. As the war drew to a close, measures had to be taken to protect these substantial, unclaimed deposits. Furthermore, since significant amounts of pay and bounties were owed to Black American soldiers, a plan was necessary to assist them in saving their earnings. At first, the 13th Amendment promised newly freed slaves a mule and 40 acres of land. But Southerners and some of their allies in the North hated the idea, so it was removed from the legislation. Instead, a different solution was offered, one that would benefit everyone involved. A group of white philanthropists and businessmen devised a plan to merge all of these banks into one savings institution, the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, or as the people would call it, the Freedmen's Bank. Now, Black Americans finally had their own bank, just for them. It was built with a very noble purpose, to help Black people build a stable life. The founders of the Freedmen's Savings Bank were respected businessmen, church members, abolitionists, and reformers. They took the initiative to create a bank based on a principle of the 19th century savings bank movement. This movement advocated for work and careful use of resources so that the working class could overcome poverty. People could open an account with just 5 cents in their pocket and earn interest on deposits of $1 or higher. The majority of deposits were modest, averaging less than $60. Over 100,000 people, including carpenters, cooks, farmers, nurses, and barbers, stashed their very first paychecks in this bank. The bank had an open system that appeared to be completely resistant to any form of corruption. Officers traveled to various states in the South and Black districts to set up branches and encourage people to save their money. The people could then withdraw the money at any time. The future trustees submitted a proposal to Congress, and on that very day in 1865, Abraham Lincoln signed a bill that established both the Freedmen's Bureau and Freedmen's Bank as an early welfare system. This bank is just what the freedmen need, said President Lincoln on March 3rd when he signed the bill. A little more than a month later, he was assassinated, making this bank Lincoln's last act of emancipation. In total, the bank had 37 branches across 17 states, mainly in the South. It amassed millions of dollars, initially passed in New York City. Its headquarters were later relocated to Washington, D.C. in 1868. Over time, approximately 50% of the bank's staff were Black. Every branch had a group of respected local property owners, serving as advisors or directors. Each depositor received a passbook that was used to record all their withdrawals and deposits. Over the course of a few years, nearly 72,000 people were actively saving with the bank. By 1873, an extensive network of over 670 savings banks was thriving in the United States, mainly in the North. These banks collected deposits from about 2 million people. That's about 5% of the American population, which makes up nearly 20% of all financial institution assets at that time. The Freedmen's Savings Bank devised an excellent strategy. They had a social mission. They believed that if newly freed slaves worked hard and managed their money wisely, they could become financially independent. The bank wanted to help ex-slaves learn about working diligently, saving money, and being careful with their resources. This way, in the future, they won't have to rely on government aid. In 1870, a newspaper called the New National Era said that the bank was doing a great job in teaching Black people these essential habits. They believed it was crucial for their success. The Freedmen's Savings Bank was groundbreaking in many ways. Number one, it was a savings bank that worked mainly in the South, in places where such banks had never existed before. Number two, this bank was unique because it specifically tried to help newly freed slaves by providing banking services. Number three, it was the first bank to have branches in different states since the Second Bank of the United States. Number four, it was one of the only banks Congress officially approved and kept an eye on. The other federally approved banks, national banks, were established and overseen by the American government through the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC. The bank directors set up the first branch close to where Black troops were stationed. Since these troops were already aware of military savings, they were more likely to use the bank's services. As time passed and the bank built its reputation, the directors started opening branches in different states. Some of the bank records have been lost to time, but historians have found plenty that still exist. Here's a bank record for Dilla Warren, opened in 1869. These surviving records are basically mini biographies. They contain valuable information about the applicant's spouse, children, former enslaver, and other personal traits that can't be found elsewhere, such as personal injuries, job skills, etc. For someone who is searching for their ancestry, these bank records are a goldmine. Experts studied surviving account register records that the National Archives had microfilmed and later digitized. They collected data from 107,197 accounts spread across 27 Freedmen's Bank branches. They also accounted for family members who lived with an account holder. That was a total of 483,082 people, which is about 12% of the Black population in the South in 1870. They then cross-referenced these records with a sample from the 1870 census. This provided insights into schooling, employment, literacy, and wealth among Black Americans. Experts found that Freedmen's Bank had a modest yet meaningful influence on the financial well-being and prospects of its account holders. People in households with an account were 1 percentage point more inclined to be literate and attend schools. These same people were 2 percentage points more likely to work and get better income compared to their counterparts. Those who had an account could save more money to make bigger purchases. They could invest in workers, buy land, or open a business. In some cases, they used the account to help cover the expenses that came with irregular income, like problems with agricultural harvests. In other words, the bank was there to provide them with a stable footing. It made a real difference for Black people. It provided banking services to those who didn't have access to them. Having a bank around led to increased literacy rates, better school attendance, higher property values, better income, and more jobs for the community, which leads us to advertising and bank expansion. In the early years, the Freedmen's Savings Bank had a huge advertising strategy. They wanted to get more people to open an account, and fast. So, besides pamphlets, cards, and circulars, newspapers were their main form of promotion. Newspapers back then were incredibly popular. By the 1830s, the United States had about 900 newspapers, which was roughly twice the number in Great Britain. Most of these newspapers were published weekly, but daily newspapers were also common. They were cheap and easy to get. In 1867, the bank's management made a list of all the African American newspapers they wanted to target. The most important of these was the New National Era, a major national newspaper that focused on the problems of the Black community. Between 1868 and 1872, the bank also had its own monthly newspaper called the National Savings Bank. They printed about 15,000 copies every month. The managers at the bank branches actively promoted the bank. They advertised the bank by talking to people in all sorts of places, like schools, churches, branches, and beneficial societies. Eventually, the bank started relying on teachers to promote the bank and collect deposits from the children. In its early years, the bank expanded rapidly. In just about 2 years, from 1865 to 1866, it established 22 branches in 14 different states. The amount of money people deposited in the bank continued to grow until the end of 1872. On average, the yearly growth rate was 60% during that period. By the end of 1872, there were over 70,000 open accounts, with nearly $4 million in deposits. This made the Freedmen's Savings Bank one of the largest savings banks in the entire country. This was money from Black people who believed that the government had their backs, but all of it proved to be a huge scam. Quick side note, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Our goal is to unlock the minds of millions of people in our culture and wake them up to the truth. Thank you for all the support. This brings us to the next part of today's video, and that's sabotage, fraud, and mismanagement. Even though the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau were separate, they were advertised as identical. But there were two major differences. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government organization, while the Freedmen's Bank was private and not backed by the government. The goal was simple: get more people to deposit money into the bank. While Congress gave the green light for the bank, they didn't guarantee the safety of depositors' money. Unfortunately, bank officers failed to mention that, and depositors believed their investments were in safe hands. Within a couple of years after it was created, the Freedmen's Savings Bank fell under the control of powerful white businessmen. These businessmen were heavily involved in politics, so what could possibly go wrong? The bank spent too much on equipment, offices, and an ample banking space. The expansion happened too quickly, and only about half of the branches could cover their costs. In the middle of this financial crisis, the directors decided to move the New York City headquarters to Washington, D.C. in 1867. That's because Washington was a better place to get financiers and political support. A bunch of directors stepped down, and financial experts D.L. Eaton, William S. Huntington, and Henry D. Cook took charge of the bank's financial committee. These three guys were close with Jay Cook, an investment banker who dealt with government bonds during the Civil War. Many of the people they hired were unqualified, and the rest, well, they were corrupt. The organization was hard to manage. Inspections were rare. The interest paid to depositors was too high, and the central administration struggled to oversee the branches. Soon, embezzlement and fraud became a huge problem. Officials started stealing their depositors' hard-earned money and investing it in risky real estate and railroad bonds. Some of it was spent on gambling, and the rest went to friends or family who needed loans. At the same time, officials were actively trying to convince Congress to make these lending practices legal. In May 1870, the U.S. Congress passed a bill that allowed loans to be granted as long as the borrower provided real estate property as collateral, and this property was valued at least twice the amount of the loan. This was the perfect opportunity for the bank's finance committee to go all in. They became even more active in fraudulent lending, which still went against the bank's rules. In 1871, Congress authorized the bank to give mortgages and business loans. Oddly enough, these loans and mortgages were typically granted to white people, often at the expense of black depositors. Risky financial decisions and biased lending practices, combined with corruption and cronyism among the upper management, gradually weakened the bank's stability. They would steal so much that they would bring the bank into a state of destitution. To get more investors, Jay Cook, with the help of his brother Henry Cook, decided to take their advertising strategy to the next level. Their marketing venture was unlike anything the United States had ever seen. They printed out ads in countless newspapers, even religious periodicals, and local papers. They created a massive network of sales agents nationwide and relied on influential public figures to spread the message. While the bank continued to lend more money, in 1871, rumors started to spread. Although we don't know who started the rumors, we can take a guess. The people who worked at the bank most likely realized something was wrong. So, they let their friends and family know. That same year, a rush of people tried to withdraw their money. The Panic of 1873 dealt a serious blow to the bank. Property values dropped, loans were terrible, and depositors wanted their money back. The panic started with the stock market crash in Europe. Investors began selling off their investments. Railroads were a new invention, so companies were borrowing money to fund their construction projects, hoping to get a return on investment years later. Railroad companies borrowed using bonds, but now they were in a tight spot. When Europeans started selling their bonds, there were eventually more bonds for sale than there were investors willing to buy. Soon, there was no one interested in lending them the money, so a ton of railroad companies went bankrupt. Freedmen's Bank invested a lot of money in these railroads. When railroads started having financial issues, the bank failed. The panic spread all across the United States, causing at least 100 banks to fail. In 2 years, over 18,000 businesses failed. Those who survived had to put their money elsewhere, like the Lehman Brothers, who invested in cattle trading. A year later, in a desperate attempt to save the bank, Frederick Douglass became president. Douglass didn't take the role because he knew about banking, but rather because he believed his influence could help the institution withstand the difficulties it faced. But the moment he figured out exactly what he was dealing with, it was already too late. He said he had married a corpse. It turned out that the trustees had taken out their own deposits. So, he informed Congress that the bank had collapsed and should be shut down. The Finance Committee sided with Douglass and appointed 3 commissioners to oversee the closure of the bank. While there was discussion about restructuring it into a new institution, they ultimately gave up, and in 1874, the bank was closed. To see what happened with the money, experts combined and studied records from bank branches in various cities like Atlanta, Birmingham, and Savannah. This helped them determine when people made deposits and who still had money in the bank at the time of its collapse. What they found will shock you. Whenever racial violence escalated in any of these cities, deposits would significantly plummet. These are all cities in the South where racial violence was common, and when Black people felt threatened, they were hesitant to deposit their money. This didn't only affect the city, but the surrounding area as well. Experts described it as a blow to trust in institutions. Like, if our lives are in danger, then how can we trust this institution to keep our livelihoods safe? Before the bank's collapse, a lot of customers took out their savings. However, others in the Black community decided to keep their accounts active. Those who stayed to the end were typically the older generation who grew up in the state. When the bank was closed, community leaders lost their money. Local business owners, educators, pastors, and charities, who were a major part of the community, were also left in a tight spot. Everyone lost a huge amount of money when the bank fell apart. The U.S. government, despite what depositors were told, was not obligated to cover any of the losses. When it shut down, the bank owed $2,993,790 to 61,144 depositors. Only $32,089 was available in cash. The rest was tied up in personal and real estate loans that would take a long time to recover. Let me show you how it worked. Let's say you were a depositor. If you wanted to get reimbursed for your losses, you couldn't count on branch ledgers because they were in a huge mass. No, you could get reimbursed based on your passbooks. So you would submit your passbook, and if you were lucky enough, 7 years later, after the bank closed, that is, you could get 60% of your initial deposits back. Many smaller depositors simply gave up when they learned they couldn't get their money back immediately. This literally broke the trust that Black people had in financial institutions, and it would end up hurting them for generations. By the year 1900, only about 62% of the total deposit amount before the bank's collapse, which is equivalent to around $1,638,259.49, or about $43,900,000 in today's currency, were returned. But a shocking $22 million in today's dollars was lost. In the end, most Black depositors lost their savings. They received very little, if any, compensation from either the bank or the federal government. But there was one thing that history failed to mention. White depositors at the bank were twice as likely to get back their entire deposits compared to Black depositors. This could be because white people knew much more about the banking system and could anticipate the bank's impending collapse. So, did they already know what was going to happen? Was this all a part of their plan? Well, there were a couple of red flags that many people missed. First, when the bank was established, none of the original directors were Black. They didn't even live in Washington, D.C., where the main branch was. Also, the bank directors lacked any legal or financial incentives to oversee the bank. The charter did not require any personal investment from the directors in the bank, nor did it include any penalties to ensure their interests aligned with those of the depositors. This is the complete opposite of the governance of the national banks, where directors were required to own shares and be held to the double liability standard. They were also obliged to live in the state where the bank worked. The bank didn't have clear rules about using deposit funds. This gave a lot of power to the directors. Although most of the deposits had to be invested in government securities, there were no specific rules for using the rest of the funds. And since Congress was supposed to supervise the bank, they didn't check on it very often. And it wasn't until 1872 that they started getting regular reports from the branches. Those who worked there didn't get paid very well. The bank was hiring people who were more like missionaries than experts in accounting or banking. This was to encourage more people to deposit the money, but left huge gaps in how those at the top could use the institution to their advantage. Damage was done to Black wealth, and it left a lasting impact for the years to come. The lasting impact of the bank's collapse. Many Black people, especially older folks, refused to put their money in the bank, and there is a good reason for that. The collapse of the Freedmen's Bank left a substantial psychological and mental toll in its wake. Most Black people lost every penny they had saved. While the financial ramifications were devastating, the emotional scars ran even deeper, leaving an indelible mark on the future generations. Teachers, community leaders, and ministries worked around the clock to convince the common folk to trust the bank. And now that the trust was broken, it could never be built again. These people, who had very little to begin with, entrusted all their hard-earned money, hopes, and dreams to the institution. This bank was supposed to secure their future and help give their children a good life. But when the people suddenly lost all their savings, their faith in financial institutions went down with it. It cast a long shadow of doubt over the country's ability to provide economic security. I mean, think about it. The United States has a history of mistreating Black people, and this kind of portrayal meant that no one could be trusted, not even the institutions that abolitionists and reformers built. The system was just broken, and there was no way out. Now, the reason why this portrayal created a legacy of financial mistrust is because their mothers, fathers, and grandparents taught their children to be wary of banks, and instead of relying on institutions, they should protect their money themselves. For many, the collapse of the bank was more than just a financial setback. It was a catastrophic blow to their finances. It caused an economic paralysis. For example, people who saved up to buy a house could no longer afford it, and those who planned to open up a business were most likely to abandon that idea and try to seek work elsewhere. And with the panic, jobs were scarce. I will discuss that later. Others put their money in the bank, money that they used to pay their rent. And now, they were left homeless, hopeless, and powerless. This trauma caused a deep-seated fear of financial institutions. This is why the younger generation of Black people wasn't that eager to invest or use banking services in any way, shape, or form. The collapse struck the heart of the Black community's collective identity and resilience. It punctured the belief in progress and the promise of a brighter future, leaving in its wake a profound sense of disillusionment. The Panic of 1873, also known as the Long Depression, was a severe economic crisis that lasted until 1878 and 1879. For the Black and white community to get back on their feet, it was essential to get their finances back on track. But recovering from the crisis was a long and gradual process. While unemployment was high, wages eventually adjusted to lower levels, making labor more affordable for businesses. This contributed to economic recovery. Despite the initial problems in the railroad industry that contributed to the panic, the continued expansion of the railroad network played a crucial role in the recovery. It facilitated transportation, connected markets, and spurred economic growth. The period saw significant technological progress, particularly in industries like steel production, which helped drive the economy. The ongoing trend of urbanization and population growth created new markets and opportunities for businesses, but the population growth and industrial expansion radically changed the face of the nation. Now, slums, traffic jams, air pollution, and poor sanitation were a growing problem. And even though the panic ended in 1879, tensions between workers and leaders of banking and manufacturing still raged on. Poverty led voters to shift their support away from the Republican Party. In the 1874 congressional elections, the Democratic Party took control of the House for the first time after the Civil War. The public's anger made it challenging for the Grant administration to formulate a clear strategy regarding reforms in the southern states, and the North started to move away from the Reconstruction efforts. Alongside the economic downturn, ambitious plans for building railroads across the South came crashing down, plunging most states into financial trouble with high taxes. In response, many southern states adopted a strategy of cutting back on spending to deal with their debts during the panic. One after another, southern states fell to the Democrats, leading to a decline in Republican influence. The end of the panic happened at the same time as the great wave of immigration in the United States. It changed people's lives forever. Both farming and industry groups pushed for protective tariffs. Politicians who leaned towards conservatism, like Otto von Bismarck, shifted away from the more hands-off economic policies of classical liberalism in the 1870s. They started adopting more interventionist measures, including imposing high tariffs, taking control of railroads, and making social insurance mandatory. Meanwhile, in the U.S., still in the post-Civil War era, the government favored protectionism. Protectionism is an economic policy where a country aims to shield its domestic industries from foreign competition by imposing tariffs or other restrictions on foreign goods. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the U.S. was focused on rebuilding and consolidating its industries. The government believed that by protecting American industries from foreign competition, they could foster economic growth, create jobs, and support the development of a robust and self-sufficient economy. This policy was especially important given the need for economic stability after the devastating conflict. This protectionist stance persisted for a considerable period after the Civil War. As the nation worked to solidify its economic foundation, it was an essential aspect of U.S. monetary policy during this post-war era, influencing trade relations and shaping the development of American industries. And when it comes to the Freedmen's Bank, its headquarters in Washington, D.C. was demolished in 1899. About 2 decades later, the U.S. Treasury Department constructed its new annex building on the same site. Even though the physical building is no longer present, the Freedmen's Bank remains a significant landmark in American history. To pay tribute to the bank's importance and legacy, on January 7th, 2016, the Treasury Department marked the 150th anniversary of the Freedmen's Bank by renaming the Treasury Annex as the Freedmen's Bank Building. Jacob J. Lew, the head of the Treasury Department, stated that the legacy of Freedmen's Bank is here to remind us of the constant need to strive for better financial inclusion for all Americans, especially people in impoverished communities, so that, in due time, people from all different backgrounds can share the advantages of our expanding economy. And so, we've come to the end of today's video. The truth is, we are all aware that there is this substantial racial wealth gap in the United States, but before there was a Great Depression or a Great Recession, Black Americans had their first money as free people stolen, mishandled, and never paid back in full. And it all happened in the Freedmen's Bank. When it was first opened, Lincoln saw this bank as an excellent opportunity for Black Americans to live a good life, while the institution's goal might have been noble at first. Those at the top decided to get rich and fast at the expense of the common folk. This story is here to help us understand why Black people distrust banking institutions. Even to this day, Black wealth problems are not new problems. They've been here for years. There is this pattern of mistreatment and loss that makes people distrust the government and private institutions. As we navigate the consequences of the Great Recession, the housing market crash, and the widening wealth gaps, the story of the Freedmen's Bank can offer a crucial lesson about how financial and political freedom are intertwined with our ability to move forward. Thanks for watching. And see.
So, lucky. So, yeah, that's the history on the Freeman's Bank, which I was not aware of, but interesting to see and to learn about. Uh, we were we were actually talking before we got on the video here about the wealth that was begun or that had came to Abraham in the very beginning, and how that wealth passed from him to Isaac, and it would have passed from Isaac to Jacob, but instead, Jacob ended up having to labor for his wives. He had two wives that he had one wife he sought to marry. He got tricked into marrying the first wife, Leah, and he ended up working 7 years for her, and he had to work another 7 years for the wife that he wanted, Raquel. And from there, he was then given a substantial part of Laban's household, and going into Mizraim later on, and being made into slaves. That wealth had greatly dissipated. Even leaving Mizraim and going into the wilderness, a lot of that wealth had dissipated. But our people had made wealth, taking various forms of money. Even the children of Israel, even the patriarchs, they took the wealth of the of Shechem's. They took all he had, and their women and their children, and their cattle, everything they had. So, and there were various situations where, our people spoiled, other people's. So that wealth should have been, trickled down from generation to generation to generation. So truthfully, we shouldn't have any disparity when it comes to money. But because of the curses, this is what we deal with. And, the curses came on us because of the wrong that we did. And so the Most High allowed that to happen. And instead of money being, instead of us being born into money, money has been a problem for us for a number of years, so a number of generations. But
Con, just to land back on the latter part of what you said, even where many of our people are at now, they're in Kebulon, known commonly as Africa. This is the richest continent on the earth, and we see year in and year out the resources being plundered by all nations for the most part. It makes no sense for our people to be living in dire situations there, with all the resources that are being exported from our Kebulon. These people should be the richest people on the earth.
right.
So much of what we use today in modern technology wouldn't be if it wasn't for the resources there in the Congo. Then you talk about the gold. You talk about so many of the resources that are there are that these people are our people are not being compensated for what's being taken out. And here in this hemisphere, you have Haiti, which is so rich, and I forget what the mineral is, but they have mountains of it,
Right.
and it's being controlled by the United States. You know, these acts are not right. Um, you know, where's the justice in all of this? So, you know, I laugh. I laugh at when I hear Americans talk about justice because you have no idea what that even means.
Right. Exactly, Art. And that's a great point. Yeah, I forget. We looked at that mineral, seemed like a couple months ago, and yeah, they got mountains of it. It's like, and then they devalued it. They try to devalue it like it don't, like, they just doing that. I'm sure because of, they don't want to be financially responsible for, uh, the Haiti, the country of Haiti. But yeah, yeah. But this is where these situations come from. Um, so 1.3 billion dollars, and then all of our, not all of our, but a lot of our ancestors here in this country, uh, robbed of their money, completely robbed of their money. And it didn't make me any, I wasn't surprised at all when he said most of the white investors, so-called white investors, were able to get their money back completely, where the so-called black investors or the black depositors would only get about 60% of theirs back. So that means you deposit $100, you get $60 back. Like, what? I just gave away $40 for what? For nothing. So anyhow, that's where we land with that one, and we're gonna close out with this Ecclesiastes chapter number 12 and verse number 13. This is always the benefit to keep us away from these heathen and in the good graces of our own power. Let us to the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. It is so very important and so very imperative that in the conclusion of the whole matter, that we fear the Most High and keep his commandments, because again, this is the most important reason that we exist. Uh, at the end of the day, when it is all said and done, when all the dust is settled and all the smoke is cleared, our judgment will solely hinge on if we feared the Most High, kept his commandments, as well as the faith in the Messiah, because this is the entire reason that we are here. I am your Akazaki Yahu, joined by my most esteemed Ak Akinanaya, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahuwah Bahashem, Yahushua Mashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say shalom wa barukim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait till the day that the Most High brings us back together and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High Power, under one covenant. Until that day, Shabbat Shalom, family.
Shabbat shalom, Mr. Paka.